meeting to order. So typically we would approve our minutes, but because we don't have those in front of us, we will move right to public comment. If there's anybody here today that would like to provide public comment, could you please come up? I think you have 2 minutes or 3 minutes? You have 3 minutes to speak. If you want to speak slowly to give Fontaine time to come back.
I'll do my best. In this new location, I'm not used to it. So I'm Jonathan Powell. If y'all want my address, 1201 Trillium Circle, Apartment B, Raleigh, North Carolina, 27606. I just wanted to come up here and talk about the importance of safe crossings. We recently had a person killed crossing, I believe, either at a greenway or very close to a greenway. And I think we need to make a big concerted effort to locate, not just on the greenways, but any place that people want to cross on high-speed roads, either to a bus stop, to a shopping center, across the greenway, and put in protected infrastructure, like preferably a hawk signal, because if you're on a high-speed road, 45 miles an hour, anything less than that, people just aren't going to yield. Some specific locations I've noticed are on Avon Ferry. I bike on there at least 3 times a week, and there are 3 or 4 people standing in the middle of the road every time, trying to get across so they can get to class. And that puts them in an awkward position where there are gaps every 2 minutes. Do you want to catch your bus and make class or miss your exam or whatever? Or do you want to safely wait, possibly miss class, right? Like, we don't want to put people in positions like that where they have to make, like, do I want to sort of take my life in my hands so I can get to my job or my class responsibly or on time? And I guess that's it for now. Thank y'all.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Hello, my name is Bill Mooney, and I live at 1902 Alexander Road at 5 Points. I work on Capitol Boulevard, right in between Old Wake Forest Road and Gateway Plaza. And so I've noticed for years that there is no easy way or safe way for me to ride a bicycle or even walk to work because of the way Capitol Boulevard just bisects the 2 sides of the city. So I would really have to go all the way to P Street and cut there, or when I drive, it has my car take Georgetown, and then I go onto the on-ramp onto Capitol Boulevard and then take the very next exit onto Atlantic, which I would not do on a bicycle. So, and so I commented on Nextdoor about how this weekend I saw a family, two families, young couples with a baby stroller, and they were walking from Watkins Grill towards, about to cross the Atlantic Avenue Bridge. They had to step over the guardrail and were walking on the dirt shoulder. And then I realized once they get to the bridge, they're going to have to step over the guardrail again and then walk on it's probably a 2-foot wide. It's not a sidewalk. It's just a shoulder on the bridge. I've seen people riding bicycles on the bridge, and it's very dangerous because it's steep. And when you come over the other side at 45 miles an hour, it's just somebody appears in your lane on a bicycle, and it's scary to come upon. It would be even scarier to be on a bicycle riding on that bridge. So I commented on that on Nextdoor today, and a lot of people chimed in and also expressed the same concerns that there, and I think even now at the Crabtree Creek Greenway crossing, it's you can't cross there right now either. So there's miles and miles where there's no safe pedestrian or bicycle crossing across Capitol. And I feel like business has developed so much in Mordecai and Person Street corridor it's been developed at 5 Points for a long time. There's a lot of, those two areas are very geographically close. And I think people would walk and ride their bicycles more between those two areas if there was a safe way to do that. And I would like to ride my bicycle to work, but I just don't feel safe doing that right now. So I hope you guys can work something out. All right,
Thank you very
thanks.
much. All right. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys, for your work. I'm Ben Barwick, and I live in 5 Points also, on White Oak Road, 2016 White Oak Road. And for really, since I've lived in Raleigh, like, Capitol Boulevard has really been a huge problem for, for everyone. Just whether you're in a car or a bicycle, and it seems like a really good opportunity to do what Bill is suggesting, and somewhere between Peace and Atlantic, there's got to be a median that could be, bridged in some way. And I also just wanted to ask you guys for an update on the boardwalk access. That is the Capitol Boulevard, the only crossing now on the Greenway.
Crabtree Creek.
Where that stands. It's been out of whack for a while, but anyway, thanks for your work, and appreciate the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Thank you. Would staff be able to provide some updates on the Crabtree Creek Greenway?
So I don't know actual specifics, but I do know that an alternative was selected. It was brought before council and is in design. They're actually going to be moving it from the existing location onto Ratchford Drive and making it on street, bringing it out of that section that constantly scours from the creek. We have to acquire some easements to make that happen, and then we'll come back down a sewer easement to rejoin the existing greenway. But it's in design, and it's relatively fast-tracked by our counterparts in Parks and Recreation.
And regarding the Atlantic Avenue corridor, we're well aware of the deficiencies and the barriers that bridge over the Norfolk Southern Railroad creates. There are currently 2 projects that are funded in that area. They're going to make some significant changes, one of which is the Blunt Person Corridor Phase 2 project. We're wrapping up Phase 1 now with the changes in the road configuration that have just gone in. There's a Phase 2 project that is planned to convert the intersection of Wake Forest Road, Atlantic, Brookside, and Automotive into a roundabout at that location. That's going to allow us to add some pedestrian infrastructure through the area that was not part of the Phase 1 project, and will get us under the bridge. The bridges themselves, with Capitol Boulevard over Atlantic, are being programmed for replacement by NCDOT. We are working with DOT as much as we can right now. Obviously, there's some things in flux with their funding situation, but that project has started project development with DOT. We are interested in working with them much in the same way that we did with their work along Peace Street and Wade Avenue, that we would look to incorporate a lot of the recommendations that were made as part of the city's Capitol Boulevard corridor plan. So we look to incorporate a lot of that. That still doesn't get us across the Norfolk Southern corridor, and so we've talked about the fact that we need to have successive projects lined up to get us north of Capitol Boulevard and with connections all the way up to Highwoods. And then obviously we have our major capital project funded north of Highwoods. So that corridor is a high priority for the city to work on developing that strategy.
Okay. Do you have a timeline for those NCDOT bridge replacements? Like, if that is in queue already for funding, or is it just in a conversation phase right now?
It's one of the ones that's suspended right now because of DOT's funding situation, so we don't know when that would return.
Okay. And in the interim, recognizing that there's a lot of right-of-way on the bridge, right? Probably sufficient right-of-way to do something interim, if we were to use a bollards approach or to do some type of delineation.
Probably not. And the reason why is the amount of traffic that comes northbound off of Capitol Boulevard that goes north on Atlantic Avenue in the afternoons.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, part of the problem is the amount of queuing that's available to prevent that traffic from queuing up out onto Capitol Boulevard. That's the safety concern that's right there.
Will the roundabout reconcile any of those concerns?
That's one of the things we're going to explore, because what that would, we hope, allow us to do is to convert those left turns into right turns around the roundabout. That would allow us to take a single lane northbound, because right now we have to maintain 2 lanes northbound, but if we can reduce that to a single lane, then yes, we can reallocate some of that. But that's part of what we will work through
Right.
with the project development of Phase 2. That project is funded and in design now with the city, and so that one would be on about a 2 to 3 year horizon for project delivery.
And there's not a public meeting scheduled yet, right, for phase 2?
Not yet. We've just
Okay.
gotten under contract with the design firm that's going to do that work for us.
But that's imminent, so I would
Correct.
encourage folks to be plugged into that process.
Very much so.
And I would like us to really assess if there, I mean, it is a very wide bridge, and it is just a matter of how we are prioritizing, fast flow of traffic versus the safe flow of people. So I think that there is some,
Southbound lane,
iterative conversations to have. What was that, Elizabeth?
southbound lane. Is it 1 lane southbound and 2 lanes northbound?
Today, it's 2 lanes northbound, 2 lanes
And
southbound.
there's a dedicated turn.
We,
right?
as part of the Phase 1 project, because we were necking down south of Capitol, we dropped a lane of traffic at Capitol Boulevard. So we've got that taken care of. The sidewalk conversation on Atlantic is a lot harder because of
Right.
the way that bridge was built, and retrofitting
Yeah.
that bridge is a
I
significant
don't like that
capital
bridge,
enterprise.
yeah.
Not so great. The 80s
No.
were not kind to us.
But I even could see, a shared facility, just like our greenways are a shared facility, if we did have the correct signage. And I mean, it's an interim step, and it is not perfect, but it's way better than what we have right now. And I would just like to have those conversations.
That's the direction that we're working in.
Okay. All right. Well, Fontaine, I saw her, and then she was gone like a flash of lightning. I have 6.
Hey,
Okay.
Eric,
We can share.
a question following up on this, since I know where their businesses are, and it's right by my house. Do you know if Phase 2 of Blunt Person takes a sidewalk up Automotive?
That's one of the things that we're exploring as part of the project scope.
Uh-huh.
And carrying it all the way up to where the new bus stop was installed up by Fenton.
Yes.
We've talked about adding that in the
That'd be
project.
great.
It looks relatively easy.
Uh-huh.
We have some constraints with cost and
Sure.
scope creep.
I know that Runology is moving, they're going to co-locate with the coffee shop, and so you're going to have a large volume of runners coming in and out of that space too. And it might also be a place, there's excess right away, maybe to do an in-lane or in roadbed. I'm glad
bollards.
it's in this scope.
All right. Wonderful. So we're just going to pivot back really quick to do, if folks can take a scan at the minutes, we may need to share these for,
If you can wait to come back to that item until we
Okay.
have copies for everyone, I would
Okay.
appreciate that.
okay, we're going to keep moving along then. Let's do introductions. Thank you. Previous chair. Kelly, do you want to start?
Pedestrian Committee. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
I'm Elizabeth Alley, Pedestrian Committee.
Paul Neville, Outreach Committee.
Susan Hatchell, Pedestrian Committee.
Mary Sell, chair.
Dwight Otwell, Bicycle Planning.
Pierre Tong, Bicycle Planning.
Liz Hester, Bicycle Planning.
Robert Parrish, Pedestrian Committee.
Eric Lamb, city staff.
Paul Black, city staff.
Wonderful. Could we get a council update then, if we're going to continue to move along?
Yes, ma'am. So, as many of you know, the new city council took effect as of December 3rd. Is that right? Or 5th?
Early December.
And so one of the things of interest to the commission that's part of their 90-day agenda is that they want to revisit the rules for scooters. So we have not been yet made aware of what the city council's direction is on that front, but we will pass that along to you as soon as we hear something substantive. So a couple of things. So new appointments were put out by Mayor Baldwin. Patrick Buffkin is going to be, did I have this right? That's right. Patrick Buffkin will be the new liaison for the commission.
Oh, I thought Jonathan Melton reached out to
I'm
us.
sorry. Thank you very
Lots
much.
of new faces.
Jonathan Melton, thank you. It's a pretty significant transition as far as city councils go, so we're adapting. But you're absolutely correct. Jonathan Melton is going to be our new council liaison for the commission. One other significant transition that's going to take place, it did not happen in time for this meeting, but as we move into the new year, we will be transitioning the agenda system that we currently use for the commission into board docs. If you have paid attention to any of the city council meetings, planning commission meetings, it is an online system for agenda management that is very different than what we have been doing historically with regards to an agenda packet. So unless you request, we will no longer be printing an agenda packet for the commission any longer. We will be using the electronic version instead. We are still working out internal kinks, and some of you heard me say this at the very beginning, but I'll say this for everyone else's benefit. But Reina Nishimura, who has provided all of our support staff, is going to be out on extended leave due to her pregnancy. And so as a result, we were looking at some transitions for how we were going to roll out board docs and training. We will be adapting to those changes, so it's a shifting landscape. So we ask that you bear with us. I think the first couple of times that we do this, it's going to be new for everybody on this end. We're all familiar with navigating board docs from the staff perspective of adding in elements to city council agendas. In this new format, we'll be actually developing the full agenda. So we're still working on what our internal processes for that are, but we've been given the expectation that in 2020, we will shift completely over to board docs. And so as we go through this, we would appreciate the commission's feedback. Again, this is new territory for everyone. So as we can always do this better and provide as much information as the commission needs, we will be endeavoring to do so.
So bring your own device, just bring our own laptops around and we can look at things in real time?
Preferably, yes.
Okay.
It is
And
so
we'll-
hard on a phone.
It's
not
yeah,
But
yeah.
it is, the mobile
Yeah.
interface is challenging.
So Eric, I was able to pull this week's agenda by going to the docs system, and there was an attachment that was able to be, downloaded and printed to get a package
For board doc, for BPAC.
for BPAC.
Okay.
Is that an option that will be continuing if it's desired, or will that go away as well?
It is not our intent to print agenda packets anymore. So it would be advisable to either bring a laptop or print your own at home.
Okay, so you will have an attachment in the online system?
That's correct.
Okay, good. So that will stay,
So we have to print our own.
if you wish to have a
If you wish
printed
to
copy.
use a paper copy.
Right.
All right, sounds good. Any other council updates?
No, just one other item administratively for the commission. Thank you for your patience. We issued an incorrect version of the commission appointments that had Ms. Hatchell assigned to the wrong committee. That has been fixed now, and so you should have a current version of the commission's committee assignment. So let us know if you have any questions about that. Other than that, I'm happy to answer any questions about specific projects that you have. Thank you.
I did have a question, Eric. Last year, when there was a fatality at Western Boulevard in Ash, pedestrian crossing Western Boulevard, we voted as a commission to ask council to look into safety improvements for that intersection. And it went to council, and they responded that they wanted to have a more systemic look at pedestrian safety across the city. Do you know what the status is? Is there a program currently assessing the safety of different crossings? What is the status of that program?
We had made a request through the budget process to look at adding a Vision Zero type program, and that request was not approved as part of the budgeting process. So
That was last year's budgeting process in
correct.
March? Okay.
And so that systemic evaluation of pedestrian and bike safety at all the intersections is in limbo right now.
Okay.
Was that removed at the council table, or did that make it to the council table
I
in
don't-
various budget iterations?
I don't remember.
Okay, thanks.
We did have the specific ask when we brought our work plan to remove it via a previous council member, so that,
Well, she didn't ask us to remove it all the way, did she?
you asked us to remove the implementation component of it.
And the advocacy component, correct.
So, okay. Any other, I had a question about Blunt Person. Much better than it was before. Thank you so much for that new facility. I'm already seeing it used pretty robustly. It's nice to have a smooth bike lane too. I mean, it's very smooth. So we're having the final decals put down in the spring. I'm sorry, what's the right word for those things that are reflective?
Retro-reflective?
Or you're referring to the individual reflectors.
I was actually referring to like the final striping for the bike lane.
Oh, that's right.
permanent.
So we don't actually use paint. We use something called thermoplastic.
Right.
Because it's got longer durability and it also has some higher retroreflectivity that reflects off of driver headlights when compared to paint.
Right.
So I don't know if the final thermoplastic has been put down yet.
I don't
It
believe
does have some
so.
temperature sensitivity, so I know,
Okay.
I know that the temporary markings have now all been corrected or in the final correct position.
Okay.
But I don't know if the final thermoplastic has been put down yet.
And there were some bike boxes with this implementation as well?
Correct, those have
And-
not yet been installed.
Okay, so the green paint and the thermoplastic will be done together? Okay. Most likely in the spring, it sounds like.
I have not heard anything formal as far
Okay.
as when that's been, how long that's
I
been
think I read
deferred.
that via like an update in an email form.
It's temperature dependent, and I know that
Right.
cold weather and thermoplastic don't get along.
That's
Okay.
correct. If we end up with a series of days like we had today,
Mhm.
then the contractor would have the availability to make that type of installation.
Okay, good to know.
They were working hard today.
And I can't emphasize enough how improved that is over what was there prior. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? Bike share update? Or do you want me to go back to doing everybody now has the agenda? Do you want me to do the meeting minutes? Sorry, this is all funky.
Fontaine, do you
Finish
have any updates on bike share?
Yes. The last station is going in this week at Pullen Park. That will complete our 30 stations and we will be fully on the ground. Duke Energy is in the process of turning on the power. We have been passing all our electrical inspections, so they're getting connected to the grid finally, which means we are near the end of closing out phase 1.
Quick round of applause for Fontaine. Thank you so much for all your hard work. I mean, seriously.
Here.
So forgive me, I'm going to ask you
Okay.
as a
Yeah.
newbie. I'm super excited when I see them popping up, and is there a place that we can point people to, like a map that's been produced that we can show people, or something we can push out, like via some social channels now that this phase is complete?
Yeah, so we have the citrixcycle.com has the interactive map. When you click on it, it will tell you how many bikes are available at each station. So that's probably the best one because it's real-time information. We do have a static one as well that we can print and share with the public. But typically, I direct people to citrixcycle.com.
Yeah, I mean, real-time info seems like it'd be a lot more useful. I'm just curious, is there like a Twitter feed we can, like, now that this is done, that maybe this next week we can like do a celebratory, some sort of communication?
Yeah, we
because I
can-
think that would be
yeah.
really cool.
We can also talk with our communications folks about pushing something out over the official Raleigh social media handles.
I mean, yeah, I think you should take a
Yeah.
victory lap on that. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great idea.
Because I went to the farmer's market the other day and I was like, oh, this is like, I knew we had talked about it before, but I hadn't been, so it was very cool. Anyway, congrats.
Thank you.
Fontaine,
Yes.
I just opened the app to see if the new station's on. It's not on yet. Where exactly is the Pullen Park station?
It will be right at the end of the main parking lot in front of Pullen Park, kind of near the aquatic center. There's a pump house there. It will be in that grassy area.
Thank you.
I have some questions on phase 2. My questions are, how are we approaching, do we have a solidified process for a public-private partnership for developers that may want to install stations? And does the city have a strategy for deploying their own facilities for phase 2?
We are still in the process of creating that official program. We are working with some developers right now who have been interested in purchasing stations.
Okay.
I believe one has already been announced, which is the one going in at Gateway Plaza. They have purchased a station and will be installing it. We're kind of using that as the test case for
Sure.
how to build this official program.
Okay, that's great. And the city side of it?
The city side,
Where did it? There we go.
I would say we're still in the process of figuring out how we want to pay for phase 2. Do we want to use federal funding again, which we learned made the project
Right.
a lot more complicated, or do we want to look at using only city funds and breaking it up into smaller mini rollouts which would remove NCDOT from the picture.
Right.
And make it less complicated. There is a question of the phase 2 locations. Do we need to revisit those because of how long ago and how much the city has changed since those were produced? And that's a conversation we have. So if we change, the phase 2 locations were selected partially via public input process. If we change those locations, do we need to get public input again, and how do we want to do that? So
Okay.
those are discussions that we're having currently.
All right. I think BPAC is interested in staying in the loop on those conversations and contributing in whatever way that's helpful.
Paul, do you have anything else to add on that?
No, I mean, moving forward, I think we're looking at first filling in some gaps in the existing system. So we can't just go put a bike share station anywhere. We've got to make sure that we can support it logistically with rebalancing of bikes and a lot of other pieces and parts of that puzzle. But we already know that an example of City Plaza is one of the areas where we know we've got a lot of demand, and it's just far enough between the other stations. There are some physical challenges there. It's all on top of an existing parking deck, so we can't just sink bolts in the ground. But we know we've got demand there. We've had a lot of interest in the 5 Points area and trying to get something out there. So we already know there's a lot of places. And I think in combination of the interest from the development community, if they have a location that we can service and make sense for the rest of the network, it's an easier conversation.
Right.
And then for the city side, it'll be just figuring out like how many of you do we want to do outside of public-private partnerships, and what would that look like? Do we want to concentrate on just slowly growing the network out, or do we want to look at areas where we have existing bike infrastructure on the ground outside of bike share where people can ride, and look at filling those in first?
Okay.
So that's the kind of policy issue that we may come back to this body to get some guidance on at some point. Right now, we're just still trying to get phase 1 closed.
But I heard it's closing soon, so that's why I led with those questions. All right, sounds good. And do you want to finish off the staff reports and then come back to?
One
I'm
thing
sorry.
to add to Paul, because I know you're looking to see if the new station is on. They're doing the site work this week because we're pouring new concrete. It has to occur. So it'll probably be about 2 weeks before that station actually gets installed and it goes live.
Great. Project and count update, Paul?
I already covered that. If there was any other questions about
Okay, I wasn't sure if the counts was referring to the counters.
Yeah, and those are in your packet. We got a new set of numbers that should cover most of the summer and early fall, and you can just sort of see what's there. Again, we're still in the early phases of this program. One interesting thing is ITRI did start to fold in the counters that belong to Parks and Rec, not just the ones that belong to the capital area MPO. So we were able to pull them in the same format. There were some interesting discrepancies. When you look at the average number, you'll see that some of them are very close, even though the total counts are very, very different. That had to do with how many days the counter was actually on. When ITRI finds data that are look like they're suspect, they will pull those out of the counts and then interpolate the counts based on the data that appear to be good. An example of that we saw in the background in the last count was there was a single day when the North Shore of Lake Johnson counters had like 32,000 people. So we know that that particular day was probably bad data. And again, since now that Parks and Rec is being able to go through the same set of algorithms at ITRI, we're seeing ITRI start to scrub the data from Parks and Rec as well.
So I am noticing the last 4 columns, Crabtree Creek Greenway, Hillsborough Street, Ridge Road, Walnut Creek Trail, Lake Johnson, are all blank, but I have seen data for Hillsborough Street. What's going on there?
And again, that may have to do with if there's a lot of bad data, ITRI will pull it and see what's going on. It may get re-released in the future, but if they think the data are suspect, they're not releasing the data at this time.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that as we're looking at on-road facilities, Hillsborough Street's a pretty important one. So we need to make sure that whatever kink we have there, that we're finessing it.
Yeah, so early on, that was getting extremely high counts, and not like in the hundreds that we think looks to be correct based on the field observation, but sort of like in the 8,000 range. What we were wondering is, are we getting feedback from passing cars in that
Sure,
in the
that makes
counters for
sense.
the bikes? So again, I'm working with ITRI to try and figure out where we do have issues and if there's something infrastructure-wise that needs to
Okay.
happen.
Right. Yeah, as we think about installing new counters, just making sure we're learning from what's going wrong here.
Well, one of the things that we're in talks with now is with NC State about doing a research project that would look at calibrating, confirming with field counts that the counters are counting accurately, but also doing surveys with folks as they're coming by and getting information about how many people are commuters, how many people are
Great.
riding recreationally or riding for other purposes. We get more information both on street and on Greenway, what our user populations are.
That's great. Thanks. All right. Any other questions or comments? Let's move on to approve the minutes then.
I make a motion to approve the minutes, please.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, back in business. All right, moving right along. Okay, quickly. Oh, gotta provide a vote. I even made myself notes this time so I don't mess it up. Can I get a vote on that?
All in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, great.
I
Moving
did
on.
want to comment, though, that on the online as well as in the packet we've got, the confirmation of the next BPAC meeting has today's date on it, and we'll be discussing 2020 dates, so make sure you don't look at that. It will be a new date after the meeting's over, probably January 13th.
Perfect. Okay, and maybe during our board comments, we can review the meeting schedule just to confirm that that all looks good to folks. Does that seem like an appropriate spot
Sounds
for
like
it?
a good item for the president's report.
Or for the chair's report?
Yes.
Okay, you can call me president too if you want, but. Okay, so can everybody briefly look at the meeting schedule and determine if those dates work? The irregularities are with the BPAC retreat in February, and also in January, we have MLK Day, is that correct?
Yep, so we're moving it to the week before.
The week before.
And would that allow the committee meetings to meet prior to the 13th?
Let's consult really quick. That is a slight irregularity, yes.
It would make
The
it
other
tough.
option would be to move it a week after MLK.
Which is the end of January.
Right.
Yep.
Is there a strong preference either way? I know Susan told me she had a conflict.
I cannot do the 27th. I can do the 13th, but if others, you can live without me yet one more month.
So the pedestrian planning meeting is on the 9th.
And I will be out of the state.
Okay, so we have a few conflicts. So do we want to look at later in the month to allow for more time for the committees to meet?
Yeah.
I know we will miss you.
I'll miss you too.
We could also discuss moving, I am in town on the 6th and 7th. If we wanted to move Ped
Real
committee.
early? But then we'd have to worry about all the subcommittees meeting
Oh, no,
before
I was
that
thinking
too.
the
For
Ped
the
committee,
Ped.
if we wanted to move
Community
Ped
Outreach
so that it
Committee
could meet in advance.
Okay,
The Community Outreach Committee can still meet on the second Thursday, which would be like the 9th.
the 9th, right? And could the bicycle committee meet on the 13th in that sense?
on the 13th.
Okay. Oh, this is hard.
But whatever.
So that leads us to sound like the 13th will work.
Okay. Sorry, Pierre.
Fine.
Okay, I'm fine with the 13th if that's what folks feel comfortable with. And we have it determined that the pedestrian committee will meet on the 6th or 7th, correct? In order
do
to
a-
get that in advance.
We'll do our
And
best.
all right. All right, we're going to make an effort to, I'll meet before and we'll do it on the 13th. So that is the one, I guess it's not a modification to that.
Also, the retreat in February.
Right, is different. And that's on a Friday, correct?
Instead of a Monday.
That's historically when we have held it, at an off-site location, if that's still the will of the commission.
Looks good.
Fine with me. So the 21st of February work for everybody for a half-day retreat? That's typically how long we meet for that.
Of course, I'll be gone, but
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and keep it there and we can work to make sure all documentation is provided to folks if they're unable to be there.
And can we ask for a motion to approve the
I'm
schedule?
going to move to approve the schedule as shown.
Okay,
Second.
and it's okay that I didn't say the motion? Okay.
Made a motion.
You made a
All in
motion,
favor?
I seconded
Okay,
it.
he made the motion. Okay,
Now we'll vote.
and can we all vote and say aye if you approve?
Aye.
Aye.
I'm doing my own little swing on it. Oh, I don't have to do the gavel, sorry. I get a little bit, you call me president, and then I got it in my head, that I was all powerful.
You hit the
Okay.
gavel as much as you like.
Moving right along. Chair's report. So I did have some exciting meetings that I got to attend this month. One specifically that I wanted to provide an update to y'all on was the BRT stakeholder group, where we will be looking at the specifics of how the bike ped network interacts with the BRT, which is obviously a large infrastructure and change in our transportation network, and one that we want to make sure that people orient with as positively as possible, recognizing that everybody who takes a transit trip starts out either on a bicycle, a scooter, or on their own 2 feet. So want to make sure that's very synergistic.
Or rolling.
Or rolling and wheeling over. Thank you,
How about
Kelly.
not in a car?
Not in a car.
Not in a
Yes.
car.
Somebody recommended me that I take a scooter even, so there.
I know, right?
How that'll work, but hey.
You know, maybe the 2.0 version of the scooters.
Where am I? She said where I am. Yeah, that'll help me see. Good, yeah.
So making sure that that is a positive experience, really great group of people, excited to participate in that. Also had an opportunity to attend via phone the pedestrian committee. I'll let Elizabeth speak to that. We talked a little bit about prioritization process and funding there. Before this meeting, attended the bicycle committee. We'll let Dwight provide an update on that. Was unable to attend the outreach committee this month, but did have a good conversation with Nick, who has agreed to chair the outreach committee. And I think that's the bulk of my updates. So could we move on to the bicycle planning committee, Dwight?
Sure thing. I do not have an official report for the Bicycle Planning Committee. We did not make any motions or take any votes. Unofficially, we talked about the bicycle network, protected bicycle network implementation. But there was not much movement in the committee that month. I can move right on to the ad hoc committee meeting, but I don't want to steal it from Elizabeth if she's got a report prepared.
Go for it.
All right. We met on November 21st with the BPAC ad hoc committee to meet with Mila and the Go Raleigh team. Let's see who else was there. Tom Barres was there. I got a couple other names. Paul Black and Mary Sale were in attendance. And we discussed prioritizing corridors for bicycle infrastructure implementation. And specifically, they were looking to make sure, Mila and Go Raleigh was looking to make sure that we provide up-to-date information on the Harrington West cycle track. And they're looking to coordinate their plans for BRT with our request for prioritization on bicycle infrastructure in the downtown core. We emphasized to the team that we need to fix the sidewalk gaps, and we're looking to push for more pedestrian space in these plans. We're considering mid-block crossings for some of the areas. What else? And they said, Mila said, and this was a mystery to me, she said the TSP is not really good downtown. And it flew right past me. I have no idea what a TSP is. I looked it up and it said something like it was like a savings plan. So the Google search didn't help me at all. Maybe somebody can help me out.
It's transit signal priority for the stoplights.
That makes a lot of sense now.
There's an interesting challenge that we have integrating bus rapid transit in downtown because a regular traffic signal in the suburbs has detectors in the pavement and a variable timing plan, and it adapts to whether a car shows up on this leg or this leg. Downtown, the entire system is pre-timed, has different timings for different parts of the day. That's one of the reasons why we don't have any push buttons for the pedestrians. They always come up with every cycle, but the regular signal links are uniform, irrespective of whether a car shows up on the approach or not. But the bus system requires some degree of actuation. That to integrate buses into a pre-timed system is kind of difficult. So that's why Mila said what she said about that
Makes
difficulty.
perfect sense now. But we did want to talk about, and Mila was sensitive to TSPs for pedestrians and talking about leading ped signals and how that works with the BRT network. Let me see. And we talked about moving curbs and the likelihood of that happening to create space for pedestrians, bicycles, or buses, and that would be a challenge. So that's probably not in the outlook, but we asked them to look into it anyway. If you remember anything else from that conversation, that's where my notes end. The one other thing of note from that meeting is that the December meeting of the ad hoc committee has been canceled, so scheduled for later this week. If anybody was planning on attending, we have canceled that meeting due to scheduling conflicts, and we'll pick it back up in January.
January 16th.
January 16th.
Community outreach, Paul, would you mind providing an update since Nick is not
Sure,
here?
no problem. We did meet last week, Thursday the 12th. We discussed some of the schedules for various open houses that we will be planning to attend as part of our outreach. Our January meeting, which will be January 9th, as we just discussed, we're going to lay out the schedule for the 2020 and which events we're going to attend, which both social events as well as CAC meetings. We have a schedule, we got a matrix put together for all the CACs and when they meet, and we'll be going to some of them. We're also planning on attending various festival-type activities like farmers markets downtown and things like that, where we can see hundreds of people in a course of an hour, as opposed to only 3 people at a CAC meeting. So we're looking at that. Nick, as you mentioned, will be chair going forward. We welcome any additional attendees, and I think that's basically all we've done.
When do you usually meet?
We meet the second Thursday. There tries to be the Thursday prior to the BPAC meeting. We've been meeting at the Transfer Food Hall at one of the meeting rooms there at
At what time of day?
6 p.m.
6 p.m. Sounds
Pedestrian
fun.
planning?
We met last week. We did not have a quorum, but we had a very good discussion. Highlights, we talked about the exciting prospect of downtown Greenway along West and or Harrington streets, and wanted to make sure that when we talk about a greenway and when we advocate for it, that greenways are for bikes and pedestrians. And there are a couple of sidewalk gaps, places in our downtown that don't have any sidewalk at all. So making sure that as we advocate for the funding for that greenway project, that we look at making sure it serves pedestrians as well. We went over a little bit about the BRT, which I think Dwight covered well, and making sure that we are advocating for the pedestrian realm in both in downtown in their planning, but also along the corridor, making sure that you can get to BRT safely and conveniently. We talked about the desire to see improvements in intersections, both with the Greenway and with other streets, and the possibility that we could eventually look at some kind of policy for intersection improvements, for example, in growth centers. And then we talked a little bit further about the implementation of the 2015 update to the pedestrian plan, which we heard from Paul about last year. And there was a figure in there that just cannot leave my mind. So I'm going to share it with you all. In 2015 dollars, we have $80 million worth of projects in our list. So I'm not telling you to advocate, but I am giving you knowledge.
That is just sidewalk-only projects?
Yes, those are just sidewalks only. That is not, those are not streetscape projects. Those are not intersection projects. That is just the list from the PED plan, which, remember, doesn't include neighborhood streets and is not even exhaustive. 80 million.
And Paul or Eric, can you remind us how many dollars were allocated in the transportation bond so we can think through?
I believe we had about 20 million total for pedestrian projects through the $206 million plan. That's not including allocations that were included as part of major capital projects. As we've talked about, projects like Tryon Road and Old Lake Forest Road,
yeah.
Those have their own dedicated funding, which includes sidewalks. So we think that once you add it all up, then as far as how much sidewalk construction that there is spread throughout the bond, it's at least 25%. So you're talking about $40 and $50 million worth of pedestrian improvements scattered across that entire bond.
Right. It'd be great, though, to help conceptualize that in real terms, versus, and even if that's something that we do in subcommittee, Paul, not to assign a task to anybody, but if we could look at that and start to check off ones that are funded and in the pipeline and being implemented, not just ones that, because I actually have this question that came up with the sidewalk gap on Glenwood, because you had mentioned via email that was identified as a project for implementation. So I'm curious now in the context of the
Right.
specific project that was
If we
asked.
gave Eric $80 million,
Yeah.
would we have a sidewalk there?
I'm just curious, what type of timeline, especially so that I can respond to this person. But, it was a sidewalk gap between Granville to Oberlin Road on Glenwood, connecting a school. She mentioned her kids can't walk to school right now because of that. Along Glenwood, there is no sidewalk, I think, connecting Granville.
There's a gap on the east side of Glenwood that's adjacent to the Carolina Country Club, and there's a gap on the west side that's closer to St. Mary's. So you're right, there's a continuity gap in there, and so we've got that identified as a project. And it's in the top quartile.
Okay.
But there's a number of projects that are already in production ahead of it, so we're
Right.
at least,
Is it
if we funded it today.
It's not funded.
It's not currently
Right.
funded, but if we moved it into production today, we would be at least 3 years from completion. Again, that's part of the problem with major capital investments.
Right.
Even a sidewalk, even
Right.
where the land's already flat and it's perfect and easy to go, there's still a significant amount of design, utilities, right-of-way acquisitions, and things that have to happen.
Can folks petition if they, how would that impact a prioritization table?
So the city council sets priorities. So any resident in the city can ask the city council to say, hey, we think this project is most important and should move it to the top of the list.
Not saying that that should be the case, but I'm curious
Right.
how that interacts with this.
Right, and so the city council has adopted a priority list of projects for those categories of projects. And so we go successively through that list of projects unless barring some major obstacle or
Right.
something that prevents us from funding it. To take a project that's in the middle of the pack or even in the top part of the list and say this needs to be the top priority, council's got to make a rationale for why it should jump all the other projects that are already in line ahead of that.
course.
And remember that we evaluate projects on a variety of factors that include safety, economic need. We look at population characteristics in terms of where do we have a much younger population or a much older population. Where does it connect with transit? So it's all those things that go into that together when we evaluate why a project should be implemented.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Elizabeth, I kind of tag teamed off of you.
So we talked about that $80 million list in 2015 dollars. Remember that, $80 million. But we also talked about like what would be some kind of wish list items in the meantime, and we talked about marking crews and the challenge that Paul has brought up of finding contractors to do our microgap projects. So kind of, if we had a wish list, it could be staff that is paid enough that they'll stay as employees for the city that could work on microgaps and the kind of like small concrete pours, maybe partnering up with bus shelters. So an acknowledgement that we will not get $80 million in the upcoming bond, we might get $0. And we have a long list of projects. We have staff working their tails off. So time to think really creatively about how we move the city forward.
Awesome. Any other questions? All right, let's move along to our network approaches to bicycle facilities. Paul?
All right, so there's a map in front of you, and I will probably turn some of this over to Mary, because I know this has been sort of a conceptual thing she wants to talk about. One of the pieces here that really is important is getting a handle on our existing network. And so Jill Reyes, when she was still here before she left us for Boise, Idaho, did a great job of putting a lot of it together.
I didn't know that Jill left the city.
Yeah.
Yes, her fiance got a job in Boise, and so did she, and so they left because he did not have a
Okay.
job here.
Okay. Sorry to see her go.
So love wins, but we lost.
Fair
She
enough.
was great. She got a lot done while she was
Yes.
here.
Look at her
Yes, she
right
did.
now.
But going through and mapping these, so some of the different line weights there that you'll see on there, you can see the greenways, you can see our existing separated bike lanes. Those are relatively dark and large. We've got some of our existing side paths are on there. And then you'll see some of the other things. There's some thinner lines where we have sharrows in purple. We do have an existing bike facility there, but it's maybe not what we're looking for in every case. There are some thin red lines. Those are projects that are all in the pipeline right now, either in design or in construction, that are going to have a bicycle component, whether it's a bike lane conventional or whether it's a side path or something else, but all of those are in the hopper with some kind of bike facility. So where are the gaps between those things? And I think that's a question that I asked. So there are some yellow lines on there that I had put together back when I worked at the regional level, looking at, if you look at really important backbone facilities that connect things regionally, where are some major gaps? And there are really two left in Raleigh, maybe three, depending on how you want to count it. And one is something going east-west that roughly connects Crabtree and North Hills over to Buffalo Road Park. That section of town really is sparse in terms of bicycle facilities. There are plans on the books for Parks and Rec to have some additional greenways going north-south, but there's nothing on the books from Parks and Rec going east and west because that's not where the creeks are. They don't flow that way. And so I think transportation, if we want to try and fill that gap, that was something that we need to look at in our next bike plan when we do an update. The other one is just completing Hillsborough Street going west to meet up with the town of Cary. The Hillsborough-Chatham Street connection is highly used by bicycles. With railroad tracks on one side, there's not a lot of driveway cuts. The sight lines are relatively good, and other than the Bojangles in Cary with the right slip lane, it's a pretty safe feeling place to ride now. But I think beefing that up and making it feel better for bikes of all abilities would be a great thing to do. And there's one really small piece that's near and dear to my heart because it's on my commute, and that's down on Tryon Road, just south of Lake Johnson. I think connecting Lake Johnson to the greenways on the Cary side, there are just a couple of gaps, and one is that small section of Tryon Road down there in yellow that we don't have any existing facilities on. We are looking at future facilities on Dillard. There is one section of Dillard that is still 2-lane, but the rest of it is relatively wide and there's room to work. Particularly where the schools went in. So I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's a middle school and elementary school co-located there and a new subdivision on the other side, so there's room to do some things. Beyond that, though, Mary, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I guess why I asked for this to be an agenda item is because we know to date we are lacking mode share with this as a transportation choice, and we know that's because a lot of people don't feel safe using the facilities that we currently have. So I would like to have a conversation about the planned implementation of our bike network as it looks today, and identifying where there might be gaps in that, as far as we do have a table identifying 10 protected facilities in a 10-year plan, you know, as far as our implementation strategy of our Bike Raleigh plan. But we know that that's not going to lead, it's not a network, right? It's not going to create a network if we have that entire table of our 10 separated all ages and abilities facilities. Those aren't connected to create, you know, I can go and get my groceries or drop my kids off at school. So I've been really inspired by what a lot of other communities have done, like Austin, Atlanta, New Orleans are some good ones, where they are doing a protected and connected approach to their bike facilities. And I would just like to have that conversation through Raleigh, and also, you know, in the pedestrian realm, thinking about how we have gaps in our facilities and we could be using more agile strategies. Bollards and paint are not expensive. Atlanta is doing a $5 million bollards and paint approach. That will get them a 12-mile network, which is humble, you know, to begin with, but it's a network, and then you are connecting people to critical destinations. And I would really like Raleigh to emulate those types of programs so that we can begin to see mode shift and create facilities that are safe for all ages and abilities, which my concern is even the Bike Raleigh plan, when it's completely fleshed out, if we are, you know, the Bike Raleigh plan calls for shares in some facilities, you know, or a shared facility where we know that that's really not going to move the needle for anybody but, you know, the Lycra road warriors. So I just wanted to talk through that, recognizing that this is an iterative conversation, and but just recognizing the need to have that conversation if our objective is mode shift. So that's where I'm coming from.
I think the feedback we've given to the commission is the same feedback we'll give tonight, which is the city council has adopted those priority projects in order of priority. And so for us to change direction and move away from those, if that's not the right suite of projects, we need the commission's input on what that right suite of projects is. If the goal is to shift to looking at specific opportunistic connections between linkages, and developing those specifically as a protected network as opposed to traditional striped bike lanes.
Right.
So that's the key that we would need, and to be as focused as possible on what those deliverables are, and then us working up what a budget for those projects would be.
Right.
And then ultimately, we have to go collectively to the city council and get the council's approval to change direction.
Right. Yep. And, you know, another thing that has come up in this conversation as we've started to talk about separated facilities is the need to maintain and make sure that they are clear and clean of debris for folks, because, you know, we struggle to, especially during leaf season, to keep bike lanes clean, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that this has to be a package, you know, deal where we're thinking through, and it's not difficult. A lot of other communities have already approached it, but it does require, you know, staff allocation resources to make sure that we are taking care of this network once it's on the ground. So I just wanted to have a conversation about that, and I certainly don't think that we would have, I think this map is super helpful Paul, so thank you for putting it together. And I don't think we would have a conversation tonight specifically identifying where all of the gaps are, but if folks can kind of look at this map and think about places they think are missing on here right now as far as connecting. I know, for instance, I have an email about the Atlantic Bridge, right? Those gentlemen who were just here, we know that that's a gap. And we know where we have 0 facilities and still need them.
Can I ask a question about the map before we go into recommendations? So the kind of lime green lines, those are roads where the speed limit is 25 and below?
Correct.
Without
Fascinating.
necessarily any bicycle facilities on those?
Yeah.
With no bicycle facilities on those?
Yeah.
So these are places that petition to lower their speed limit.
Because the city default is 35. That's what you're getting at, right,
Correct.
Elizabeth? And this
Yes.
seems like a lot
Yes,
more
my
than you would
inference
think.
I was surprised by how many there are. I think that's great. And also thinking that, a policy recommendation that we've discussed is, or that I recommended is considering how we could make design speeds and marked speeds 25 in neighborhoods, which would go some way towards, I think, building in this grid. But I also, I really liked Kittleson's phrasing, and I'm sure that there is a formula behind it about low-stress streets, when they were talking about the streets in downtown and what gets priority for bikes. And I'm sure it's more than just a speed limit of 25, but it's probably some kind of ratio of speed and volume or something like that. Be interesting to see what that formula is and if we would be able to plug it in here.
Yeah, a good resource for that is FHWA has put together a rural bikeway design guide that has a matrix that shows that relationship, and maybe the speeds and volumes are just slightly higher in urban areas in terms of what's allowable. Really, the volume side is a little higher, particularly in congested areas. But again, it's a really good starting point.
Yeah.
It's not a full one-to-one translation to
Right.
our environment, but it gives a really good idea of what to be looking for.
I guess the nice thing about an urban environment where we have finite space to widen roads is that volume could actually decrease travel speed because of congestion. That's congestion, right? It's trying to fit a lot of stuff through a little tube. So yeah, that would be one suggestion I would have, would be to look at that policy of making more low-stress roads. Stop building roads we have to protect people from.
Right. Well, I think because, the discussion earlier of Atlantic Avenue Bridge, and since I'm a resident of 5 Points, I think, when you look at the fact that you cannot connect there, but when you just look at 5 Points by itself without Mordecai, there really is no connection. And Glenwood Avenue is an extremely dangerous place to bicycle, and it's actually becoming a more and more dangerous place to walk, with traffic far exceeding safe speeds. And it's not going to be a bus rapid transit corridor. I guess I would love, I think it's an important part of town that isn't really well connected. And I think it's great. I mean, you could see this map shows really lovely things about what's happening in downtown and what's happening around the university. And I think, that's really encouraging. So I would just, kind of think about how you grow to Glenwood South, how you grow to 5 Points, and how you keep, maybe adding on to those. And, maybe it has, St. Mary's is extremely hilly, but, I think really just kind of thinking about what could happen to try to connect those northern neighborhoods a little bit better.
I see there's two different things being displayed here. There is the connectivity for, let's call them biking and pedestrian throughways, which I think that the Greenway system and some others are okay. But mostly what I hear about the concerns of the commission here are not throughways, but connectivity. How you connect this to that to that, which is a more point-to-point, a shorter point-to-point thing. And so I'm thinking that this diagram tries to do both things at once and is a little bit confusing. If we focus on the neighborhood connection to the school, to the location where the bus station is, that's more of a micro point-to-point map.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, but that's a little overwhelming on the staff side. So from a staff perspective, in terms of getting things done, I tend to look at the through, but not because I'm interested in the through movement. And I always use an analogy of it's cars, but the Champs-Élysées carries 100,000 cars a day, but very few of those cars are going from one end to the other. They're making a little piece of that trip. So by building these longer pieces, you're going to get a lot of those shorter trips, but people maybe aren't going all the way down the Walnut Creek Greenway, but maybe they're jumping on it to bypass some roads they don't feel comfortable on and then going back into a neighborhood.
If they become the arteries and then the neighborhood connections are the spurs off of that, that would make sense. However, I don't know if the desire in the neighborhoods is to use the greenway to get to the school or just to get to the school.
Right.
I mean, considering where our greenways are, you know, along creeks and in sewer lines, they're kind of by nature a circuitous route to your school, right? There should be a safe and direct one.
That's my point.
Yeah, this might get to and hopefully with neighborhood streets.
And we do have a Safe Routes to School program that addresses schools at least.
Yeah, and has funding.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm funding for it.
And to remind the commission of the dichotomy, and for the folks at home, the BPAC, the intent of the BPAC is to focus on the on-road system. The Parks, Recreation, and Greenway Advisory Board, their responsibility is to focus on the greenway system. Obviously, there's an area of overlap as it relates to users and user bases, and the ability to coordinate with our friends in Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources on their available funding and their own program. We have recommendations in the Bike Raleigh plan that suggest what are the priorities, but those are actually addressed through the Greenway Master Plan. And a reminder, I think that several commission members are involved, that the Greenway Master Plan is up for an update this year and is being actively looked at. So there's a good synergy there to take advantage of.
Yeah, and something that I like to point out, even though some of them are probably not up to current standards, or we do have many, many miles of side path on Falls of the Neuse, on Avent Ferry, on Western Boulevard, and they do see a fair amount of use. They could probably use a little bit of love at some point. Some of them, I think, Eric and I were talking about Western Boulevard, and that went in almost 20 years ago and was built to standards that were probably 25 years old in terms of like what it did for bicycles, but it's still used on a regular basis by people. Again, I don't know sort of how that factors into the discussion, but those longer pieces are not always greenways. There's a lot of it that's actually still on street.
Random question, but do we have any info from public engagement from the 2016 bike plan that we can use to help with this discussion? Like any info from that?
We can look. Are you referring to specifically the geography of where people are most interested in facilities?
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in what comments there are generally from
Okay,
people.
we can look for that.
Okay.
Was that one of the ones that, I'm getting all my plans confused, but I think that they used heat mapping in that one, right? And so there was some methodology taking in like community input, but also looking at things like poverty levels and car ownership and things like that. So certainly gotta
Yeah.
reason the list is the way that it is.
And
It
with-
doesn't mean that there's
and with
not
the-
room for improvement.
And with the 10-year priority plan, there have been some movement on that. I know that right now the only thing we can point to are the bike lanes on Maywood between Lake Wheeler and South Saunders, but there are a number that are in the works. Another one, the number one priority, which was Green Road for conventional bike lanes. That was up for repaving, but it's actually now been tagged to another project. There is actually a project on New Hope Church that's going to also tie in not only the bike lanes and the repaving on Green, but there's also a sidewalk project on Green that's in our sidewalk list. And so all those have been lumped together and will help save money and help hopefully attract more bids to the city. But that's another one that will get knocked out sometime in the near future. There were a number of other streets that were in the list, and it may not be the entire project that's listed in the 10-year plan, but most of these were going to be neighborhood bikeway sharrows, conventional bike lanes, and then the greenway projects that are shown here with the highlights in red or blue around them. So at least those parts of the 10-year plan are slowly making their way through. But again, Green Road, I think, was one I wanted to look at, and there's another that was either Rush or Illy Agnes was also on there, and was originally in this potential list of repavings, but did not make this list. But since it was on there, we are probably going to see it again in the next year to 2 years, and some more of those will get knocked out.
Best practices for when a protected lane is like really prudent, almost mandatory, like a speed and volume stress threshold. Because I don't think none of the 10 in that list are protected, right? It's just
No, there's a few different tables. So there are conventional bike lanes, there's buffered bike lanes, then there's protected facilities, and each of them have, and then there's the neighborhood bikeways, which are sharrows and different treatments in the neighborhood context. So there's some different tables that call for different treatments.
Okay. So in our top 10 list, are any of them protected? Not
We have a table that references, I think, 10 projects that are all protected.
Oh,
None of them have been implemented yet.
I think there's 8 protected, 10 conventional. I don't remember how many were sharrows and neighborhood bikeways, and those are interesting because they tend not to just be linear. Sometimes they'll be an entire neighborhood.
Yeah.
And they might be 4 to 6 streets, not just one.
The connected
And then there's the 5 greenways that are shown on the map here. Because greenways are not our purview, we did want to reflect them in the map, but we only showed what we knew was in the pipeline in the plan, because again, that's not our purview.
And the entire bike plan is available on bikeraleigh.org for folks to be able to download
I was
and
just trying
the
to search it
individual
on the
chapters.
city's website without much success.
It is, we actually have it on a separate website. So we've given you a lot of information to go
Right.
through, and we've given you some fairly static and busy maps.
Right.
I have a few suggestions. So,
Yes.
So one, I think this is exactly the type of thing that, to ask a committee such as the bike committee to dig into this in detail. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So I think that putting this type of effort in committee would be recommended.
Right.
We eat the elephant one bite at a time, and this is going to take some time to go through and
Right.
literally digest aspects of the map. And also, there's a little bit of QC we need to do about projects that we know that are in the pipeline and add a few layers to this as well. So
Right.
this is a work in progress. But I think as we start to be able to turn on and off layers and look at some of those demographic issues that we have from the 2016 plan, to look at need populations, look at rooftops, we can start to see where it is we can make those connections that would be the most advantageous. So that's my suggestion, to take a deliberate look at this
Yep.
and take some time through the bike committee to come back with those recommendations on how we would change the current prioritization that's in the bike plan.
Sounds good to me. I would like to make one comment, and then I'll make a motion to that effect unless others have some. When we're talking about facilities like Maywood, that's an island to me, right? It's not, right now, Maywood, we have Lake Wheeler Road, and then you have Saunders, right? It's not, what are we connecting people to? Like, they can ride back and forth to Trophy after they get their beer, that's cool, but I want them to be able to ride their bike to Trophy to get that beer. And right now, we're not creating a network that allows for that. And so that's the pinch point that I want us to finesse.
So philosophically, again, in parallel to all the individual projects and capital improvement projects that we program, there are resurfacing projects as well. And those are an opportunistic means of us incorporating recommended facilities. And we reevaluate not just bike, but also all vehicular markings as part of all resurfacing projects. Mayview is an interesting case that we knew that there was a significant amount of bike traffic that were accessing some of the businesses along Maywood, and it's in close proximity to the Greenway for Walnut Creek that's just down the way.
Right.
We have a sidewalk project that's programmed in that area. It's going to create some of those linkages between the Greenway and Maywood.
Right.
But the thing from our standpoint is, if we don't take those opportunistic
Sure.
leaps when the resurfacing comes
100%.
through, then we get the sidewalk connections and
Right.
whatnot in. We have to come back at a later date and fill in those gaps for bicycling. And
Right.
so
Agreed.
it's a chicken or egg kind of conversation about when we do these. But I think we've approached our bike network on street in much the same way that the Greenway system was developed. It was a little bit of a shotgun approach to begin with, but then as we started to reach critical mass and started to make linkages, then the system became much more complete.
Right.
We're going to see that here again as the network continues to mature, as we keep systematically chipping away, because realistically, all the city's streets are on a resurfacing cycle. So these major streets that come in on a 10 to 15-year cycle, that's our opportunity to revisit and build out the system at a very low
Agreed.
cost.
I have a question in that regard. Are there ever times when the desire for a connected bicycle network could influence the order of priority of street resurfacing? I'm sure it's not going to be like bump it from 2030 to 2020, but like 2021 to 2020. Do you all ever have any kind of say in that?
Typically not. Right now, the primary driver for resurfacing is pavement condition.
Sure, and they've got their work cut out for them.
We've got limited resources for resurfacing. We're in better shape now than we've ever been in terms
Yes.
of funding. And that was due to a dedicated 1 cent property tax allocation that was made several years ago by City Council. That covered about half of what we needed, but it got us better off than what we were before.
Yeah.
So right now,
Do you know how much revenue a penny turns over a year?
I found out today that that number is around, will be around 7 million after the revaluation takes place.
So if we had a penny, we could get through that PED list in 12 years.
I
Funding.
knew she was going
Sorry.
to say that.
I'm always going back to that number.
And remember, for any
Sure.
type of project implementation, it's a mix of what we have for our capital program and what we have for available staff and workload.
Undoubtedly. I understand it's not just an issue of funding, so being a little daft, but helpful to know. Maybe there are some ways that we could shift stuff a little bit, as if the golden opportunity to connect things arose.
Yeah, and one other piece that affects the repaving schedule is adjacency of other projects. So if they realize, if we repave this, there's going to be a chunk of it that gets torn up by this other thing.
Sure.
Then they will also put it off.
Great.
Yeah, we
Makes
do a lot of coordination with public utilities to make sure we're not resurfacing a street and then
Sure.
they tear it up the next year.
Or if there's a major private development coming where they're going to be real hard on a road,
Exactly.
like a school or something like that. Great.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and move that we put this to the bicycle subcommittee. Unless you had something pressing.
We can work it out in committee. We need to be specific in what we're trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
But we can have a general motion here, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I would like to move that the bicycle subcommittee works to identify where there are gaps in our current network and the need for a protected and connected network approach. Right. Okay, is that succinct enough?
And how that compares against our current adopted priorities.
Right. Yes, as what Eric said. I'm getting tired. All right, can I get, we have Robert provided a movement. Can I get a second?
Second.
Thank you. And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Wonderful. I'm getting this down.
So before we move on, there's an additional handout as part of this. This is the 2020 repaving schedule with bicycle facilities highlighted.
That's a lot.
So I promised you I would try to get you this in December, and this was hot off the presses about 4 hours ago.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
One other item I wanted to point out is there are 3 projects here that are going to also be getting permanent bike counters. As part of the resurfacing, we're going to be installing the loops in the bike lane so that we can get permanent counters installed.
Wow.
That's a great
Fantastic.
list.
Yeah, that is great.
All right.
Busy boy.
It's a big
Yeah.
list.
It's a big list. And I see some roads on here that are some real familiar names. I mean,
Yeah.
this will
isn't-
help.
Yeah,
This will really help.
this is a big deal.
And Paul, just so I'm clear, all the ones that are highlighted on this list are the ones that we anticipate having bicycle elements.
Correct.
Okay.
So they're on this map.
They are not on that.
No, they
map.
are not on this map.
Well, then
because
the map's out of date.
In addition to that, yes, ma'am, it is.
yeah, the ones that are shown on there are all the major capital projects that are in the hopper. So those will be things on par with like Hillsborough Street Phase 2 or Buck Jones Road. Those big projects.
So one ask I did make in committee to Paul on this is I would really like to identify and understand if there are any abilities to put a buffer in where the bike plan may not prescribe that. So prescribe just a conventional lane, because I'd like to be thinking through if we know we need a protected facility to make people feel comfortable riding their bikes, then I would, if we ever have the real estate to do that, I'd like to be putting the buffer in as a default.
Yeah, and we're doing that just because, again, the plan just says non-vertically separated. So if it just calls for a bike lane, there's nothing that precludes us from doing the buffer other than the actual physical space. I know last year, if we had the space, Rebecca was including those in the pavement markings.
Okay.
We
just
are
wanted
doing
to make sure
buffers
that
as
was
a default now.
Yes.
perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Because I do think that a further amendment to the bike plan should be the vertical separation. Okay, moving right along to the bicycle parking standards and drawings.
All right, so this did come out in your packet. What I had in your packet was showing you what the city of Oregon, or Portland, Oregon does. And of course, that's Portland. We don't want to be like them. But in this case, they've done a lot of homework so that we don't have to, which is a great thing.
Pierre's like,
We're
that's
not
not so bad. I mean, if we have to be like somebody else.
Right.
Yeah, that'd be the one.
Take a little here. We might not have this, but that's okay if you've got it
I
there.
don't seem to have that.
Oh, it might not have been
That's all right.
printed. It was in the original electronic packet that went out,
Probably.
but here
We
we've
have
got,
it in front of us.
we've got copies to pass out. And not that you have to like look at those. We're probably not going to do everything that's in there, but just to give you an idea of the kinds of things we're looking for, because that's what we're after tonight. Is right now this is just informational. We want to let you know that this is going on. So we already talked a little bit. I think it was the October meeting when I was overseas and wasn't here for the discussion, but we talked about the ordinance change to the number of bicycle racks dealing with a specific use and some of the changes. I think it was around a soccer park that was going to have to install like 200 bike racks based on the current standard. So staff had looked at that and went through. So these are the things that are in the UDO right now. So the Unified Development Ordinance talks about very general provisions in terms of, you know, the racks must be securely anchored and provide clear and maneuverable access. They're all sort of very basic things. It also talks about the need for both short-term, sort of coffee shop parking, and long-term, I'm at work all day or it's going to be stored overnight kind of parking. They're two different things. And
Like in and out.
that's kind of what we talk at, you know, where you're going to be at a meeting, well, like this, where you're going to be here for maybe an hour or two, but it's not all day.
I think the term we've used is the difference between providing parking for a customer versus providing parking for employees.
Retail parking.
And there's also a table in the UDO. Again, you don't have to really look. This is more just to give you an idea of the scale and scope that goes into the different short-term and long-term bicycle parking requirements, as well as the vehicle parking requirements. We actually got a really great sort of shout out in the UDO in terms of equal treatment. I always like to show people this. I think this is a great thing that Raleigh has done. So it's sort of 3 tables long, and then we're out of the UDO and into the design manual, and this is the part we really want to talk about today. So a quick revisit of what's in there. Again, there's some additional verbiage that talks about different things that goes into a little more specifics than the UDO in terms of sort of here's the spacing, here's the kind of sizes we're looking at for both a standard U-rack and a bike parking corral. Here's what the drawings look like in terms of spacing. So you can see I don't know if you can or not, but they show the little bike racks in these funny elongated ovals, and they show some of the distances. And I want to point out that this minimum 2 feet setback from the curb, I think internally we're really looking at 3 feet now. We found that the 2 feet is not always enough. It has not been codified yet, but in practice, that's where we've been moving.
You're going to widen the sidewalk commensurately? Yes.
In most
I mean,
cases,
it is going to eventually encroach into
with
their
the
walkway.
urban sidewalk standards that we have in the UDO for downtown between 14 and 16 feet,
Yep.
moving it back a foot still leaves us plenty of room. What we were finding was that we were having consistent conflicts with on-street parking
Yeah.
and people opening their doors.
Yeah.
The rack itself
Yeah.
is far enough back, but once you
But
put a
the bike-
bike in place,
Yeah, you're
then
right
it becomes
against the door.
problematic.
Those cars are even encroaching on our sidewalk space.
It's a system.
I'm mostly kidding.
And so here's what a bike corral in the street looks like, where you've got the curb stops to make sure that vehicles don't run into it, even though they still sometimes manage to do so. And then sort of how you actually mount the U-racks. And that is the extent of what we have. So in terms of additional ideas that we want to look at, some things we don't talk about, what's our design vehicle? What about electric cargo bikes that are popping up? I know someone who's an owner of an electric cargo bike sitting right here.
Right there.
And right there. And I've seen in fact, I chased one up the hill on Dix thinking, oh, I can catch that guy on the cargo bike, not realizing he was an e-assist until I was completely winded and gassed at the top of the hill, and still didn't catch him. And,
Serves you right.
So, yeah, serves me right. But
Don't
they're out there, and they are different in terms of how we have to design the parking. Just a bike with a trailer. If you are pulling children or something else, or just your cargo in a trailer behind your bike, can you fit in our standard U-rack? If you can't, how many of these do we need to provide? Is it something we need to do on a regular basis, or is this a special thing that we need to just accommodate on a sort of case-by-case basis? How do we factor this in? Looking at some other things, we only dealt with a standard U-rack mounted parallel to the street. There's a lot of other ways to do that. One of them is, diagonal. There's places where this might have to happen in order to make sure that we can fit things in the pedestrian realm. And this is how we make things coexist. So again, Portland has looked at some of these things. They've already been there. This one is looking at bus stops. All of these are in your handout. But Right now, we don't really deal with any of these things in our design manual, and we're finding that as things become more complex in the downtown, as we have a more diverse set of users, and it's not just somebody on a standard bicycle, there's some additional things that are coming up that we've got to deal with, and we want to make sure that we're ahead of the curve and not having to deal with them sort of as they happen to us.
So speaking of our fine friends on the West Coast, I was looking at Seattle's design manual, street design manual, strange hobby, right? And they recommend a 30-foot clear from intersections for viewing pedestrians in a crosswalk, which leaves a lot of space, even more space than we call for now, where you cannot put parking. Not bike parking, car parking, which leaves a huge opportunity at intersections where we could be looking more and more at bike corrals. But I know that that is not something contemplated in our streets manual, nor is it something that you are allowed to install to meet bike parking requirements if you're doing private development. So something we might want to think about.
A lot to unpack there. Right
Yeah.
now, the city's...
It's almost like I think about this a lot.
The city's standard for an offset from a crosswalk is 25 feet.
Yep.
So we do have this very similar
From
dimension.
the part furthest, yeah, the part closest in.
From the front of the crosswalk to where the first parked car would be.
Okay.
To create open sight lines associated with, you want to make it clear for when a pedestrian's entering. It's even better when you've got a curb extension
Yeah.
to deal with
Yeah.
that. But one of the things that we changed a few years ago in the code was the distinction between parking and bicycle parking.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we established was you can not do vehicular parking for cars at that 25-foot point, but bike corrals are totally allowed. And the Wilmington Street installation is probably a very good example
But we
of
haven't
that.
allowed any private installations of those, have we? I don't believe we have. I think when you go through site plan review, I think that your parking has to be like on-site. I don't know if they're permitted to put in, say you were developing the Dillon and the Weaver Street and you wanted to put a lot of bike parking in the street. I don't think you can do that to satisfy code yet. So maybe something to look at.
That's correct, and it is contextual in terms
Oh,
of
of
whether or
course.
not the standards, if you're developing an urban footprint and you're required to put bicycle racks in the
Yeah.
public
Maybe that would
sidewalk
be like a design adjustment or
versus
something like that.
interior to the site.
Yeah.
We do not currently allow an exemption for allowing the installation of bike parking to offset car parking requirements.
Right.
So that
Not yet.
does not currently exist in the code.
Yeah.
I think I got all your points though.
Yes, thank you.
So
Mostly it was thinking that we have we're fighting over scraps, right? We're talking about space in the sidewalk, and we can always make sidewalk standards wider, and I want to accommodate as many bikes as possible. Just want to make sure we're thinking of the entire right-of-way as places where we could park all of these new design vehicles.
And what vehicles should we use if there are best practices for amending our code in order for developments to take advantage of that and create a more people-oriented place from the onset? That seems like a win-win. So is that something that staff could look at? Or how would we have those conversations?
That's a good question. We would probably need to talk about that offline, what some strategies might be.
Okay.
Yeah, and this whole, I know scooters are not our business for this commission, but as we're moving forward, it seems like this will be a space for scooters to be corralled so they're not on our city streets, perhaps, if this same 25 feet would be allowed to accommodate scooters. I know a lot of cities have created scooter parking zones, and you must leave your scooter in those zones. And I think it seems to work pretty well.
The
It
conversation.
is something, oh.
I'm sorry. You want to go ahead?
What are the zones, do we know anything about the zones presently, though? Because, I mean, it seems to me they are neatly stored.
It's much better.
Yeah, it's much
Yes.
better than it was.
Right.
So is it going to be any different than what you're proposing?
So we are considering putting in some designated scooter parking areas.
Oh, is that the difference? They're not designated?
So they are designated. The places they've been staging them right now are sites that we've worked with Gotcha on to kind of set up so they go to the same location every morning and set scooters out in a pre-designated area. There are some parts of our agreement that say, for example, they can only put 4 per block face. That's to keep any one block from just being overwhelmed with scooters. But we do know where there's locations where people have been requesting more than 4. So one strategy we're looking at is creating those scooter hubs where we can increase the number that would be staged without inundating the sidewalk.
Right.
With the
Are
one thing-
those behind the curb or are they in the roadbed?
It's going to vary depending on location, but we are looking at some that would be in the roadway.
Yeah.
And-
Great.
And the conversation we've had specifically with Gotcha is a financial strategy that there'd be a standard price for taking a scooter from hub to hub, but still having the free range aspect that if you want to take it to your place over here, there'd be a slight financial penalty for doing that. So provides an incentive to keep them in hubs, to keep them more orderly and organized.
Yeah, and that seems to be working very well in other cities. And I think it helps you have more scooters if they are, being somehow or another corralled and I think.
Cared for.
And cared for, right. So I
And
think,
it makes their availability geographically more predictable.
exactly.
And I think Nashville is one of the places that does that. They've recently shared their design specs with us for those spaces so that we can get a sense of what our space needs would be.
What policies do we have? Do we have any policies around bicycle parking, non-standard bicycle parking? Like if I go to the store and there's not a rack available and I lock up to the handicap sign, or just lock my bike to itself and park it in the sidewalk?
As long as it's not impeding traffic, you have the latitude to do that. There are some limitations, if I remember correctly, in the code about locking to trees specifically.
Shoot.
So, but otherwise, there's no limitations on adding parking to a sign. Now, the other half of that is that we have specs for standard U-racks, because those are simple, and we can get those from a black powder coat that's relatively consistent among manufacturers. If someone wants to do a custom bike rack, then what we allow those to be done as is by encroachment on public property, or they're allowed to do that to meet their standards on private property. And in those cases, and the most notable example of that is what's over by Beasley's on Martin Street,
Where chicken and your.
That's right. And so they wanted to put custom racks to kind of align with their business. They are responsible for maintaining those racks in the public right-of-way. The city is not responsible for those racks. And we do allow those by encroachment.
This is a tiny bit off topic, but where does the city stand now on bike share, not scooter share? I know that the council had not wanted to have bike share until we had our system implemented. So do we know where we're going to go with that?
It turns out no one's offering bike share
Market
anymore.
took care of that.
It's just gone.
It is gone. And in fact, I was talking to representatives from NC State a couple weeks ago. Lime Bike is still operating bike share bikes on their campus. It is one of only 2 locations in the country where Lime Bike is continuing to operate bicycles. All of those bike share companies abandoned bike share bikes in favor of scooters.
that makes
So
sense.
it leaves our bike share system ruling the roost, if you will. A lot of people encouraged us to abandon our bike share project development for a dock-based system in favor of the free-range bikes. We're very glad we didn't, now that the market has dried up. And I understand that NC State has a contractual agreement with Lime to have that service provided for a number of years going forward. At the termination of that term, probably you'll see those share bikes go away.
Well, that brings up my next point, and that what I'm hearing is hitting the cities now is mopeds.
That is, from what I have seen online, I know that DC is probably the closest market that is now experiencing rental mopeds. That is correct. And there's clearly existing laws and regulations that go along with those. There's also a trend towards e-mopeds that also gets a little blurry. So we'll see what happens when that market wave hits us.
Okay.
What makes the mopeds challenging, especially in North Carolina, is the need for insurance. It's something that we face with the scooters too, as being kind of defined as mopeds. But with mopeds that are clearly mopeds, there's going to be a challenge. They will need to be registered with the DMV, have license plates, and have insurance.
The drivers have a driver's license.
Right.
That is something for the companies to figure out, but it definitely will make it more
Okay.
challenging.
Well,
I
glad
have
you
another
guys are keeping an
question.
eye on it.
Do these bike design standards, does this impinge at all on new development is required to provide indoor parking for bicycles for long-term parking? Is that correct?
Now, again, that's still something that was in the UDO, and so most of what this deals with is what's in the public realm.
Okay.
Yeah, the what's in the UDO for short and long-term parking, long-term doesn't necessarily have to be indoor. You can do indoor spaces to meet that requirement, but we've had a number of commercial businesses lately that have put in covered bike parking. So you'll see,
Yeah, it's required to be covered, but not conditioned space.
that's right, it doesn't have to be conditioned space. So noteworthy, there's a Chick-fil-A renovation took place on Falls of Neuse Road. They now have a covered canopy out in front where they've placed bike racks underneath that. So that's a very prominent example. But we're seeing now that start to occur with certain businesses.
I have a question for the cargo bike users. Like, how necessary is a rack to lock, what is it, 200 pounds? How much does your bike weigh when it's an E-assist cargo bike? Like, if you lock it and leave it there, is there a good chance of it being somebody like gathering a team of folks and carrying it to a pickup truck? What kind of parking is needed for a cargo bike, the folks that have
I
experience with
mean,
it?
to date, I've been able to easily use what we have. If there is another bike there, I can still kind of pull up adjacent to it. But I don't know if Fontaine has thoughts, but I mean, it is a larger bike for sure. But before that, we had a Burley, which was a longer bike, and I think that probably impacted the right-of-way more so than this one does.
Well, I was thinking less about like what you need in a locking rack, but like, is it a rack absolutely necessary for a big
There
cargo
are the
bike?
ability to lock the wheel,
Lock the
in
wheel. Is that
place.
secure? Like, do you guys feel secure doing that? Are there any idea how many times these things are stolen?
I know in communities where they are more common, there are higher levels of theft because I think there's more they can resell them
Right.
pretty easily. If I'm going into a business quickly, like say in and out in 5 minutes, I typically am fine with not locking it. But if I'm going to be gone for, an hour and out to dinner, I do lock it.
And mine doesn't have a self-locking wheel, so I have to use a conventional lock. So thanks for starting to look at these different design guidelines. I think we also saw a business that reached out to y'all about wanting to do the vertical ones. So that's good to see that folks are interested in testing out some of these. And I think the most important thing is that we're making sure that we don't impact, the pedestrian right away and that we're keeping these tucked to a side.
I
so
did
everybody
have
can
one
get through.
question about the design. Sorry, going back to that. For the
Sure.
private businesses, when they want to install something on their private property, is there their review of the design, or they just kind of, yeah? Okay.
Right, it would be part of their site plan review.
But
Okay.
after the fact, no, they're just put in.
Right,
Yeah.
so as
I just
part
think of some that I've seen that you look at it and it's like, oh, that
That's
looks
not
beautiful, but like you can't fit a lock
Oh,
through
yeah,
it.
if they already got their certificate of occupancy and they just put one up on their private property,
Yeah.
yeah, that we wouldn't catch.
Okay.
But if there's one that was needed in order to meet the ordinance
Right, right, right.
requirements, we would see that.
Okay.
There's requirements as far as placement. It has to be within a certain proximity of the main entrance to count as far as short-term parking. But yeah, if somebody just goes and buys something and calls
Fair
it a
enough.
bike
Yeah, I was
rack
just
and
curious. I mean, it's your
sticks
private
it up-
property. If you want to put something that
Exactly.
blocks it, fine. Yeah, I mean, yeah, but I was just curious how it worked in the site review. Thanks.
You touched on it briefly. This project or this standards are vertically challenged. And I think the reason is I found in the standards, the user is not required to lift the bicycle into the bicycle rack. But I think there's valid uses at transit centers, private businesses, where a vertical type of rack should be considered as part of this. And it's totally missing from this document. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I think a vertical type style might be advantageous in some areas.
And I've been trying to think of where we have examples of that, and the only one I can think of is over near Videri Chocolate. There's one on private property in their courtyard that's a covered vertical rack. So if you want to see one, there actually is one over there.
There's a private business over on North Street, just off of Glenwood, that has sort of a clamshell that has their bikes racked vertical.
Good.
Yeah, it's just a challenge when bikes are heavy.
Right.
Like, so
As an option, but not mandatory.
for sure, yeah, because like even other people, like electric bikes would be nearly impossible to pick up and hang that way.
Right. And the market may be trending toward electrification, as we're seeing with the scooters. Electric bikes, I feel, are a whole new mobility option. All right, do we have any board comments? We don't need any action from us on the bike standards.
No, again, this is more just more of just an FYI for now, but again, if you think of things, just contact staff. And I think a great example was Paul talking about vertical. Again, it's not in there, so making sure that that's on our radar, that's the kind of things we're looking for.
And I did make note of what Elizabeth said about, I mean, I think that there are opportunities for us to be rethinking how we approach this from the development standpoint too.
I'll make one more comment about kind of using up sidewalk space. It's important that we look at these in parallel with all of the other things that eat up our sidewalk space, thinking about pups and outdoor dining requirements and like the dimensions on these, like they fit, but then you think about what happens when somebody's getting their bike out of the rack and you're pulling it out, right? When you're in reverse, right? You're blocking the entire sidewalk. So if our sidewalk's really wide, you wouldn't be able to, but you add that in with outdoor dining and trees and all kind of garbage cans, and all of a sudden our sidewalk doesn't serve its primary purpose, which is not parking.
Which is why I think on-street bike corral should start to be looked to as a more and more viable option for a bike storage location.
Yeah.
But we'll continue this conversation, I think. Do we have any board comments?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, where you want to go?
No, you go.
I was going to say, I have two quick ones. One is I did want to reiterate that Dwight and I went to the kickoff for the Greenway Master Plan the other night. It was just a social. The real kickoff will be in January. And the steering committee meetings are not open to all, but I would like to say that Dwight and I will certainly keep the commission informed, because there will be a series of public meetings that I would love to make sure everyone attends as part of our work here. The other thing I just want to do is talk about, because we were talking about Vision Zero, and earlier Jonathan was talking about this, and there's an interesting statistic from Seattle, and it's other places as well, in Seattle's Vision Zero, and that is if you're hit by a vehicle at 20 miles an hour, you have 9 out of 10 chances of survival. If you're hit by a vehicle at 30 miles an hour, you have 5 out of 10 chances of survival. And if you're hit by a vehicle at 40 miles an hour, you only have a 1 in 10 chance of surviving that accident. So this is the time of year where, it's dark and people are kind of getting in a hustle bustle here at the holidays. I'd just like to kind of remind everybody that, speed kills, and that lowering speed limits would save lives, obeying speed limits would save lives, and enforcing speed limits would save lives. And that goes for pedestrians as well as bicycles. So I just wanted to bring that up, and this is from 2019, but the AAA Foundation Traffic Safety found very similar numbers in 2011. So, we're seeing, unfortunately, I think a lot of communities are seeing an uptick in pedestrian and bicycle deaths. We've had quite a few recently here in Raleigh. Everybody needs to remember that, making safe crossings is important. Trying to remind people to not dash out in traffic, but as Jonathan said, sometimes people have difficult decisions. Are they going to be late for work? Are they going to be late for class? And then when we're driving, we need to remember how deadly our vehicles can be. So that's it.
Kind of sobering statistics, obviously.
I'm sorry to be a downer, but I just feel that it's important to remember that dashing about in your car is a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, and on that note, I would also add to be sure to look more than once when you're turning your vehicle. I had a friend who was hit by a car, got a compound fracture in his leg in bike commuting. So, and that's just one person that I know about, and I'm sure it happens all the time. Left-hand turn. So, and also everyone be careful.
Yes, yes.
So this ties together with two things and something you just said. Earlier, Paul mentioned about the rerouting of the Crabtree Creek Greenway around the boardwalk section that was mentioned earlier. So it's someone has at Purview. That's where the Greenway would be on surface streets. And for those of you that know that area, it's totally shut down now. It's starting to deteriorate. That's the boardwalk section that comes up to Capitol Boulevard. City spent millions of dollars on that lumber. And I'm just wondering, as a comment, and could you pass this on as our liaisons to the Greenway Committee, When the new facility is in place, obviously it'll be taken down for, liability issues. So we're going to have tons of usable lumber, and I thought it might be good if we could recycle that lumber for repair and replacement of our other wooden greenway sections, stockpile or warehouse it somewhere so it doesn't just sit there and deteriorate, because we spent a lot of our tax money on it, and it was a grand design that didn't work because of the erosion along the creek. So let's use it when it's available. Let's use it for other repair and replacement and save some cost. Just a thought to pass on to the Greenway Committee.
We'll do it.
Because if you ever go out there, if you remember it, that's a lot of wood that we could reuse, and not all of it's, bad, and
Wooden
I'd hate to see
switchbacks.
that chipped. Thank you.
Wanted to relay some public comments that I got while we were on our marvelous downtown street audit. And this was concerning 5 Points. I talked to a few women that live in the area, and I guess NCDOT has changed the lights recently, and so there is a flashing left turn. And they were saying that is giving drivers a level of comfort to proceed into the intersection and dart when they might have been more cautious, and it is a direct conflict with pets crossing the road. And to that extent, wanted to see if we could look at LPIs or non-pedestrian actuated signals, and perhaps some signage. The ideal in their mind was to take out the flashing yellows, but something tells me NCDOT is probably not up to that. But
Yeah, but
room
that,
for improvement.
that would mean reverting,
second that.
they call it a permissive left, so it would be
Yes.
reverting the permissive left back to a red for the
Yes.
left turn.
Yeah, I think that somebody came and spoke to us about that as well, and I know exactly, I walk in 5 Points
Yeah.
pretty regularly, and I do think that in certain places, that type of signal increases the driver's urgency to try to do it. And I do think it is cutting
You do have
pedestrian.
permission to go into the
Right, you
intersection,
have
yeah.
permission, and I do think it encourages a little, in particularly since that intersection's so wide and has so much space, there's all these kind of cars not knowing which place they're supposed to be, and I think it does encourage people to kind of,
Go for it.
well, to not be paying much attention to the fact that this is a pedestrian crossing. It's also a place where we don't have high-vis crosswalk. There's a lot of pedestrian improvements I think we could look for in 5 Points.
Agreed.
Okay, any other comments? I think most of mine have been addressed. One other question that I had two separate people randomly ask about was, again, bridge access across I-440 bridge at Lake Wheeler. So the neighborhood, like the Carolina Pines neighborhood, and then how do they get back into downtown? The I-440 bridge, that turns into Lake Wheeler, right? Am I thinking of it right? If you continue down.
That's like Wheeler from going south from,
So that just two separate
Farmers
people
Market.
brought that up
I-40
to
at
me.
Lake Wheeler does have sidewalks across that bridge currently.
I think they were more concerned about being able to safely bike across. So, FYI.
Very good.
I think all my other ones have been
And as
addressed.
someone who's biked that, every interchange, there's just interstate interchanges are always going to be
Oh, well,
tricky for
yeah,
bicycles.
absolutely. But is there a bollards and paint approach? Do we have the right of way to provide?
It wouldn't help because you're going to have all the incoming, outgoing interstate traffic come
Well,
across your
It wasn't my
protected bike
comment. It
lane.
was
No.
two separate citizens reached out to me independently about it.
So I'm not
this
saying
month.
we shouldn't do anything, but I'm saying
Right,
that
of
they
course.
always present a challenge.
I know.
And I don't know that anyone solved it yet.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, there was one other one. It was Milburnie. And just this concept of, as we are deploying bike lane facilities and not immediately marking it to not be no parking, that there's confusion there for the user and it's not creating a safe facility for the bicyclist. So if there's, I know that right now we have a process where we go back to council to seek approval for parking to be removed, I think, after the project, but it does seem explicit to me that that is being provided through the support of that project initially, when that's, I just feel like that conversation should be rolled into one so that we can have a more seamless deployment of new facilities coming online. That's all I got. Any other comments?
What section of Milburnie were you talking about?
That was specific to the traffic calming project. I'm not sure what there was road
east of Raleigh
constraints.
Boulevard.
But there are some other sections of Milburnie that,
Further east to Wake, Med Greenway area then?
right.
Right, there was a
Thank you.
prior project out there where we installed bike lanes early on as part of the very first wave of bike projects where the parking was not restricted. We are now looking at a process to go back and talk to the community about what types of restrictions we can put in place, given now we've extended these bike lanes with the new traffic calming project, and we've had a number of requests with concerns about conflicts with on-street parking.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing is with that facility, if there are lessons learned that perhaps aren't a current best practice, I would just like us to revisit those. There's a spot where it necks down for a pedestrian crossing and the bike facility disappears. And I know my husband, that's his route to work, and he now uses a different route to work because he has too many close calls with cars try to scoot around him there after the bike facility leaves. And I had another person also comment on that to me. So just thinking through, I know that that was, you know, an older project that got implemented, but as we have these time lags and scales for bigger projects like that, we're just going to need to be really receptive to changes like that that might not be a best practice as we implement. All right, I think unless others have comments, we're ready to wrap it up. Upcoming events? Announcements?
There's no meetings scheduled between now and your next BPAC meeting on January 13th. There is a public meeting on January 14th at Leesville High School. This is in Northwest Raleigh for the next widening project along Leesville Road between Westgate and O'Neill. That will be at 6:30 at Leesville High School.
I thought, Paul, didn't you have January 6th?
Yes, we have I was just waiting for the opportunity. But formerly West Street Cycle Track, formerly Harrington Cycle Track. Now we're currently going with the name of the
Greenway.
Downtown North-South Greenway Connector, just because it's going to be connecting the future Pigeon House Branch Greenway with the future Rosengarten Greenway down to Dorothea Dix. And we have an open house looking at a number of alternatives for making that connection. It'll be January 6th from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. on the 9th floor of the Dillon, which is their entrance lobby, even though it's on the 9th floor. And we hope to see as many of you there as can come. But what we basically have done, I think, we brought that here last month, didn't we? So you all have seen some of the alternatives that we were looking at. But we want to bring those out to the public and get feedback to see if there is one or two that rise to the top that staff should really concentrate on to try and make things happen and move
We
the
should
project forward.
pedestrian gaps maybe at that public meeting too.
I'll do what I
Not
can.
to
I'm still
overly
counting parking
complicated.
spaces. But
Sure.
yes, we know of a couple, like the ones that are near North Street on Harrington, that have already come before the commission, and we'll see what we can.
Right,
So-
and on West Street, just south of Peace.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think now up where there's still construction going on, I mean, we don't
Yeah.
really know. We
This
know
is
that
on the
it'll
west
get
side
built,
of that
but-
street, yeah,
But yeah, there's not a lot of it, so we should be able to do that.
not much.
All right, wonderful. So our next meeting is January 13th. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.